Good morning, everybody. We've got two readings today from Jeremiah, and how we're going to do it is that I'm going to read the first section, then there's going to be a linking statement from John, linking the two passages, which Barry will read, and then he will read the last part of the reading. So here we go. The reading is from Jeremiah chapter 37, verses 1 to 15. Zedekiah, son of Josiah, was made king of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He reigned in place of Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim. Neither he nor his attendants nor the people of the land paid any attention to the words the Lord had spoken through Jeremiah the prophet. King Zedekiah, however, sent Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, with the priest Zephaniah, son of Messiah, to Jeremiah the prophet with this message: "Please pray to the Lord our God for us." Now Jeremiah was free to come and go among the people, for he had not yet been put in prison. Pharaoh's army had marched out of Egypt, and when the Babylonians who were besieging Jerusalem heard the report about them, they withdrew from Jerusalem. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of me, Pharaoh's army, which has marched out to support you, will go back to its own land, to Egypt. Then the Babylonians will return and attack this city. They will capture it and burn it down. This is what the Lord says. Do not deceive yourselves, thinking, the Babylonians will surely leave us. They will not. Even if you were to defeat the entire Babylonian army that is attacking you, and only wounded men were left in their tents, they would come out and burn this city down." After the Babylonian army had withdrawn from Jerusalem because of Pharaoh's army, Jeremiah started to leave the city to go to the territory of Benjamin, to get his share of the property among the people there. But when he reached the Benjamin gate, the captain of the guard, whose name was Irijah, son of Shelemiah, the son of Hananiah, arrested him and said, "You are deserting to the Babylonians." "That's not true," Jeremiah said. "I'm not deserting to the Babylonians." But Irijah would not listen to him. Instead, he arrested Jeremiah and brought him to the officials. They were angry with Jeremiah and had him beaten and imprisoned in the house of Jonathan the secretary, which they had made into a prison.
John's link passage first. Jeremiah continued his ministry, speaking publicly that the siege would end in defeat for Jerusalem. The best thing to do was to surrender to the Babylonians while that was still possible. And this made him even more unpopular with some of the members of Zedekiah's court, and they petitioned the king to have him executed. The king gave in to them, and they had Jeremiah arrested again, and this time he was lowered down into an empty water cistern to starve to death. So we continue at Jeremiah 38, 6 to 13. So they took Jeremiah and put him into the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank down into the mud. But Ebed-Melech, a Cushite, an official in the royal palace, heard that they'd put Jeremiah into the cistern. While the king was sitting in the Benjamin gate, Ebed-Melech went out of the palace and said to him, "My lord the king, these men have acted wickedly in all they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. They've thrown him into a cistern where he will starve to death, where there is no longer any bread in the city." Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Cushite, "Take 30 men from here with you and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to a room under the treasury in the palace. He took some old rags and worn out clothes from there and let them down with ropes to Jeremiah in the cistern. Ebed-melech the Cushite said to Jeremiah, "Put these old rags and worn out clothes under your arms to pad the ropes." Jeremiah did so, and they pulled him up with the ropes and lifted him out of the cistern, and Jeremiah remained in the courtyard of the guard.
It's great to be part of this service with you today. We're going to be thinking about Jeremiah and his experience of being in prison. During this time of lockdown, we've been looking at several people in the Bible who experienced imprisonment. And the reason for that is that very often for us, lockdown has felt a little bit like being in prison. Now, it's nowhere near as bad, but it has been a sense that of being restricted, of being limited, of not being able to get out and do the things that we normally do in life. And there has been for us this sense that lockdown has felt a little bit like being in prison. And that's why we've looked at various people in the Bible and their experience of imprisonment. And this morning, we are going to look at Jeremiah and his experience of being in prison. Just sort this out, hopefully. Okay. So Jeremiah is one of these many guys who were in prison, and here he is. I just need to explain that Jeremiah was a prophet a good many years after the time of Micaiah and Hannai, the two prophets we looked at last week. And if you remember, Micaiah and Hannai were prophets when the Jewish kingdom was divided between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Each had their own capital, Samaria in the north and Jerusalem in the south, and each had their own king. But at the time of Jeremiah, things were quite different. The northern kingdom of Israel had ceased to exist. It had been assimilated into the Assyrian Empire. And now the only kingdom left amongst the Jews was the kingdom of Judah in Jerusalem. And in Jeremiah's time, oh, am I not showing you the slide view, the slideshow? Let me just see if I can get that right. In Jeremiah's time, here he is with just the kingdom of Judah. And in his day, in Jeremiah's day, the kingdom of Judah was under massive threat from the Babylonians. And Jeremiah's ministry was one where he was preaching that the Babylonian invasion was God's judgment on the nation of Judah, that military resistance to the Babylonians was futile, that the Babylonians were going to win, and that the people of Judah were going to be taken away into exile. And of course, that made him very, very unpopular with those who were trying to mount a military resistance to the Babylonian threat. And it's because of that unpopularity that Jeremiah experienced that he was put in prison. Now, Jeremiah was put in prison twice. Once in a kind of dungeon underneath a house, and a second time in the bottom of an empty water system. And we read about those experiences of imprisonment earlier. And I want us just to look at Jeremiah's experience and reflect on what it says to us today. Now, the first thing to say about Jeremiah is that he, like Hannai and Micaiah really, he was imprisoned because he was serving God. Certainly his second imprisonment, where he was lowered into the cistern, was because many of the king's court didn't like the fact that Jeremiah was prophesying that the Babylonians would win. And so they said to the king, he's discouraging all the soldiers, we need to get rid of him. And he was put in prison. But he was put in prison for no other reason than that he was serving God. And I've spoken about this before, but we just need to note that there are Christians today who are in prison because of their service of God. Mercifully, we don't face that in our country here today, but nonetheless, we do experience a sense of being restricted because of our commitment to God. So if we take on responsibilities in God's service, and I've listed lots of the things that we do here in church, Sunday school, youth work, duty deacons on Sunday, worship band, the welcome team, house groups, leadership team and finance team, Alpha course, the coffee giveaway, the CAP money course, toddlers, carers club. All of those things involve the people doing them committing time and effort to those activities. And that time and commitment can sometimes feel like being restricted. You can't go away on the weekend that you're on duty in the worship band, for instance. And there are other things that you're not free to do because your time is committed to prepare for the things that you've said you'll do in the service of God. And of course, quite outside the work of the church, there are other commitments we take on for God. And all of our commitments bring with them a sense of being somehow kind of limited or restricted because we're committed to doing these things. And it feels as if we're not free to do the other things that we might want to do. And we have to recognize that we live in a culture that really does exalt the idea of freedom, that being free to do your own thing and being free to do what you want in our culture is one of the greatest things, the highest aspirations that people can have. And so it becomes quite difficult for us to accept commitments and responsibilities in the service of God that somehow restrict our freedom. But the reality is, Jeremiah, Hananiah, and Micaiah all speak to us about the way that we must be willing to take on in the service of God things that will lead us to feeling restricted and limited, commitments that will mean that we're no longer as free as we might want to be to do all the other things that we did. And actually, most significantly, it's not Jeremiah or the other prophets who are the most powerful example of this. It is Jesus. These words about him in Philippians 2. Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus accepted the limitations of becoming a human being. He is eternal God, and yet he chose willingly to limit himself to time and space when he became a human being. And he accepted those limitations in order to serve God and fulfill God's redemptive plans for mankind. And when you and I sometimes find it irksome that our service of Christ commits us to things that mean, actually, I can't go to that party now. Now, actually, I'm not free now on Sunday mornings to do those things. We need to remember Jesus, who accepted a far, far greater set of limitations than we ever will in order that he could go ahead to serve God. But sometimes, like Jeremiah, people are imprisoned because of their faithful service to God. At other times, I know Barry Steele loved this picture of this little lad. Sometimes people are imprisoned unfairly, and certainly that was Jeremiah's experience. His first experience of being imprisoned was because when the Babylonians temporarily withdrew their army, the Egyptian army was on the move, and so the Babylonians took their army away from the siege of Jerusalem just to go and see what the Egyptians were doing. When that happened, Jeremiah took that opportunity to go and check out the land that God had called him to buy, Anathoth, and just kind of finally stamp it as his own. And as he was on his way out of the city to do that, he was arrested because the guards thought he was deserting Jerusalem to join the Babylonians. Now, that wasn't true at all, but nonetheless, he was still imprisoned. And his experience of imprisonment was one that was unfair. And there are those verses 11 to 14 of Jeremiah 37, describing his experience of being imprisoned unfairly. And sometimes our sense of being restricted or being held back feels very unfair to us. We wonder why it is that these particular circumstances, this illness or this unemployment or these set of family circumstances, we wonder why these have happened to me. And it seems unfair that these things, these problems should come my way, and that my life should be restricted and limited by these different things. And we can echo in our own experience something of Jeremiah's feeling of the unfairness of his imprisonment. But when we understand that sometimes we are restricted and limited in a way that's unfair, it's important to recognize that actually things happen in an unfair way in this unfair world. We live in an unfair world. It's an unfair world, not because God made it that way or because God can't rule it properly. It's an unfair world because it's a fallen world. That's a world that has rejected God and gone its own way. And in rejecting God and going its own way, the world has chosen injustice and unfairness as the pattern for its life. And that means that all of us who live in this fallen world experience injustice and unfairness. And it comes to us in a whole variety of different ways. And the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent killing of George Floyd illustrates how unjust and unfair is the world in which we live. But when we feel that our imprisonment, the restrictions and limitations on us are unfair, it's not because God created the world to be unfair, nor is it because God has abandoned us or can't look after us properly. It is rather that we live in a fallen world that is unfair, and unfair things happen to us in many different ways. And of course, as well as Jeremiah being an example of that, Jesus is a far more powerful example of how it is to suffer because you live in an unfair world. Jesus had done nothing that deserved death, and yet he was crucified. He was flogged and beaten, and a crown of thorns set on his head, and he'd done nothing to deserve it. And it happened to him because in this fallen world, many things happen that are opposed to God and his purposes for creation. And although God was at work in Jesus ultimately to bring redemption to the world, that didn't justify or make right the injustices that Jesus suffered on his way to the cross and in his crucifixion. And when we feel unfairly treated, then the example of Jeremiah and others can be helpful. Here were people who were imprisoned for no fault of their own. But far more significantly, the example of Jesus speaks to us as someone who was unfairly treated in this fallen world. But the thing I want to say to you, the last thing about Jeremiah, he was imprisoned for serving God, and he was imprisoned unfairly each time. But significantly, Jeremiah was imprisoned twice. He was imprisoned when they thought he was deserting to the Babylonians, and then the king set him free. And then later he was imprisoned again, a second time. And there is a sense in which the second experience of imprisonment for Jeremiah would have felt worse than the first. It would have meant that he was asking these questions. What, again? What must I have done wrong to end up in prison twice? I mean, what's happened to God's care for me that the same thing should happen a second time? Where is his love and provision for me that I should end up in prison a second time round? And we need to recognize that life feels like that to us too sometimes. We lose our job, and by God's mercy we find another. And then we're unemployed again. We're sick, and by God's grace, we recover. Then we're ill again. We're in debt, and we find a way out. And then we find ourselves in debt again. And in many ways, our experience can be similar to that of Jeremiah, where we are restricted and limited by a set of problems that God seems to deliver us from. And then those same problems come back and get a grip on us again. And we feel that we are imprisoned twice. And that can be a shattering and a difficult experience for us. And we begin to wonder, has God given up on me? Is there something so wrong with my life that I have to keep on going through the same problems again and again. Even though God delivers me once, I'm back in the same trouble again. And once more, the experience of Jeremiah helps us here. I mean, God had not abandoned him, nor was there anything wrong with his faith. There was nothing particularly broken about his life that meant he was imprisoned twice. He was imprisoned unjustly. He was imprisoned for serving God. He was imprisoned twice. But there's nothing about his second imprisonment, nothing in the Bible about his second imprisonment to indicate it was because of any massive fault on his part. But again, it's not only the experience of Jeremiah, it's the experience of Jesus too. If you know the Bible well, you'll know that when Jesus was arrested, he was put on trial before the Sanhedrin. And then he was put on trial before Herod. And then he was put on trial before Pilate. And you can imagine that if Jesus were to think the way that we sometimes think when the same problems come back to us, he would say, well, I've been on trial once. Why do I need to be on trial a second time? Why do I need to be on trial a third time? And Jesus is an example of someone who faced the same difficulty for Jesus in his trial on at least 3 occasions. In fact, you can argue that there were more trials than that if you count in the times that he had to appear before Pilate in between the Sanhedrin and Herod. But there is a sense in which experiencing the same difficulties more than once is not because God has abandoned us and his plans for us has failed, nor is it because we have done something so bad that we have to be punished twice for it. It's not that at all. Nor is it that there is something drastically wrong with our life or our faith that these problems should come back a second time. Jeremiah and, more powerfully, Jesus are examples of those who suffered the same difficulties more than once for no fault or blame of their own. And so what I want to say to you then about Jeremiah and his experience of imprisonment is this. He was imprisoned unfairly. He was imprisoned because of his service of God, and he was imprisoned twice. And we can all find echoes of Jeremiah's experience in our own lives today as we seek to live for Jesus. And it is these experiences of imprisonment that call for endurance on our part. This is I think one of the greatest verses in the New Testament, written in the book of Revelation by John, the apostle whom Jesus loved. He says, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. He's in prison. Patmos is a prison island. And what John is saying is, in his experience of imprisonment, knowing that in the Bible there are those who've been imprisoned unfairly, those who've been imprisoned because of their faith, those who've been imprisoned more than once, knowing all of that, John, who himself is imprisoned, says that he is sharing the suffering, the kingdom, and the patient endurance that are ours in Jesus. And those 3 things, suffering, kingdom, patient endurance, are very significant for us. You see, only one of those things looks a positive experience to have. That's kingdom. The idea of kingdom is the idea of reigning with Jesus. And John says that we share with Jesus his reign over the world right now. And it is true that in Christ we are ruling and reigning and have the authority and power that Jesus has, that is shared with us. And we experience what it is to rule and reign with him over the creation of God. And we do that right now. But the other 2 things, look negative to us, because as well as reigning with Jesus, we suffer as he suffered. And because we suffer as he suffered, we need patient endurance as well. And that the suffering and patient endurance don't seem nearly as positive as the reigning. But the three are all grouped together. And it is significant that of the three of them, two of them look negative. And only one of them looks positive in our experience. And one of the things that we need to say is that while we are in this world, we will reign with Jesus, but we will also suffer with him. And we also need the same patient endurance that he had when he endured his suffering. And just in case you think that this is a bit unfair, there should be just one positive but two negative. In case you think that doesn't sound such a good deal or so loving from God to me, I want to remind you of this verse that Paul wrote of his own experience of suffering. Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. You see, in this life, reigning, suffering and patient endurance may sound a bit unbalanced. There may look to be a bit more negative stuff, two negatives, just for one positive. And we may wonder just where the justice or fairness or rightness is in that. And again, we may reflect on our own experience of being restricted and constrained because of our commitment for God. Suffering limitations and problems unfairly that are just not our fault. And perhaps of the same problems coming more than once to our lives. And we may wonder what's going on and where things are all meant to fit together. And certainly, in the perspective of this life only, we will struggle to see just how it all fits together and makes sense. But one of the most powerful truths of Jesus is that this life is not all there is. And that there is an eternity beyond this world that Christ has granted us share in. And that these, our sufferings in this world, which Paul describes as light and momentary, are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory. And I would encourage you, if you feel in prison this morning, unfairly, for your commitment to God, in prison again and again in the same difficult circumstances, I'd encourage you to believe this verse, that these light and momentary troubles are achieving for you an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Because they are, it's what the Bible says. And our experience of suffering creates in us a patient endurance that fits our souls for heaven. And heaven's light will be all the brighter for the darkness of our suffering in this world. And though we can't necessarily see just how that works out, the Bible affirms it is true. And when the days are dark in this world for you, I want to give you this assurance. Heaven will seem all the brighter because of it. And there will be a glory all the more amazing awaiting you in Jesus in eternity. So the Lord bless us and give us the patient endurance that we need in our experience of suffering in this life. Amen.